Rabbi Abahu, Rav Safra. All right, we got to get a little bit of background on these two scholars because otherwise the story is not going to make sense. And we all love a good story, but we need context. So we can tell immediately, Rabbi Abahu and Rav Safra, that we are dealing with the Talmudic period. That is to say, we're not talking about Hillel and Akiva and the early days of the Mishnah. We are talking about once the Mishnah is done, and we are now into the Talmudic range between 250 and around 600-ish or so of the Common Era. Everybody's with me so far. But why is one named Rabbi and the other is named Rav? Well, this is indicative in Talmudic language that Rabbi Abahu is a native rabbi who was given ordination in the land of Israel. Now, at the time, Israel was not under our jurisdiction, but who we chose to make rabbis was. Instead, we were under the jurisdiction first of the Romans, and you may remember they were not terribly pleased with us. And then later, as Rome moved into the Eastern Empire, and then Constantine made Constantinople his capital under Christian authority as well. Everybody has that? But Rav Safra didn't natively come from the land of Israel. He came from what we would call the land of Babylon. That is to say, the various incarnations of the resurgent Persian Empire that lived in the area that we would call Iraq and into Iran. But we would just call that Babylon, even though Babylon as an empire was long since gone. And rabbis from that area have the title Rav because there was a little rivalry between the rabbis of Israel and the Ravs of Babylon, of who had the higher level of smicha, of ordination, of status within rabbinic hierarchies. We don't need to go into that too much. But this is a story that involves this as our setting. Everybody with me so far? I know it's always hard to start a story with a little history, but sometimes it's needed. Hopefully you'll forgive me. So Rav Safra was moving and now living in the land of Israel. Now, because he came from the land of Babylon, that means he came with all the Babylonian scholarship and all the Babylonian traditions, but it meant that he had to get introduced to the local non-Jewish authorities by a local rabbi. You had to have somebody who would vouch for him that indeed this was an important man, not just some random person, because with that level of importance did come certain perks in the eyes of the non-Jewish government. Most notably, tax breaks. Much like we now have parsonage for clergy in the United States, if you were considered to be an important enough rabbi, even the non-Jewish tax authorities would give you remission on your taxes. And Rabbi Abahu, the local boy, gave the credentials for Rav Safra, the man coming from Babylon, in order that the local non-Jewish authorities would treat him with respect and would give him these perks. We're good, right? Okay. And everything went fine for 13 years. Rav Safra is living in the land of Israel under the rule of these non-Jews, and he is getting all his tax breaks. Everything is going fine until one day the heretics, as the Talmud wants to call them, accost Rav Safra in the street. Now, this was not that uncommon. The reason the Talmud calls them heretics is they were most likely a group of early Christians, and one of the great sports of the early Christians, once they had governmental authority and backing through the Roman Empire, was to demand public debates from different Jewish people. So it would be, hey, you defend your faith, defend your Judaism, answer us this question. And the questions would often be questions about Tanakh, about the Bible. If this sounds familiar, good, you've been paying attention to the 21st century in the United States. So, Rav Safra is asked by these heretics, tell me, this verse from Amos, chapter 3, which we just read in the Haftarah, so this should all still be fresh in your mind, it says that I, says God, have chosen you from among all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all of your sins. What in the world does that mean? That sounds crazy to me. And Rav Safra had no answer. And so the heretics wrapped a scarf around his neck, paraded him through the street, pushed him and pulled him, and generally humiliated him because he couldn't give them an answer to what that verse meant. Of more than its own translation, he could not give them an interpretation of meaning that would satisfy them that it was okay. Now, Rabbi Abahu, remember, who vouched for this man, comes up and sees them mocking Rav Safra and says, "What are you doing?" And they said, "What are we doing? You told us he was a great man. You told us he was a scholar. He can't even answer our question about this verse." To which Rabbi Abahu explains, well, no, he is versed in the wisdom of Babylon, which is primarily the wisdom of the Tanaim, of the sages, the wisdom of the Mishnah and the Midrash, not the wisdom of the Tanakh, not the wisdom of the Bible. That is something that we, the rabbis of Israel, are better at. Notice, again, the little bit of inter-rivalry between the two Jewish groups. So the heretics say, all right, fine, local boy, you say that the rabbis of Israel understand the Tanakh. You tell us what this verse means. And he explains, well, you have to understand. Imagine you had two people and you had lent money to both of them. You lent money to a friend and you lent money to an enemy. It's a parable. It doesn't have to make perfect sense. This is when it comes time to collect from your friend, you will collect a little bit, a little bit, a little bit at a time to make it easy for your friend to repay the debt. But when it comes time to collect from your enemy, you will demand full payment all at once, bringing the most pain to that enemy. Now, this is considered a sick burn, as the young folks say. If you notice, what he is essentially saying is that God will, yes, demand that we pay up for what we have done, but that's just justice. But God will do so in a way that is spread out over time. Whereas others, like my interlocutor, my heretic friends who are standing here in front of me, when God calls your debt to due, it's going to be on a lump sum payment that's going to bring you to your knees. Again, the subtlety of the rabbis, sometimes we forget how incredibly biting, sarcastic, and funny they could be. But then they also asked, but I don't understand. Why is it that you rabbis of Israel can interpret the verses of the Tanakh, but the rabbis of Babylon do not? And he says, well, again, with a certain degree of sardonic charm, it's because we live among you and they don't. Meaning, the rabbis of Babylon don't live among these heretics. They are not constantly being berated and demanded that they give their explanation for themselves, that they defend their faith, that they look into the Tanakh in order to play the games that you want to play of answer me this verse in some form of gotcha attitude. Instead, they get on with studying. They get on with living Jewishly and don't have to play those games. Whereas we, the rabbis in Israel, we know what you're like, and we know what we have to do to be able to answer what you are asking. We have to have in our pockets answers to these questions from the heretics because you're going to demand them of us. So I want to ask you, do you have your answers? Are you prepared? Because as much as we may hate it, we are much more in the Rabbi Abahu camp than we are in the Rav Safra camp. Maybe at some points in the middle of the 20th century, certain Jewish communities could get by without ever having to explain themselves or defend themselves, without ever being accosted or demanded of information or questions. But now, not so much. And I don't just mean that rabbis are being asked to make public statements about Israel or about politics. I mean rank and file Jews are facing this in a more or less constant way. So let me give you a few questions that have been asked by the heretics, and let's see whether or not you are prepared to answer them. And if not, well, we need to work on that. So a question that came to me from a high school student just recently that was being accosted by her, I'm sure, well-meaning Christian friends, was to give a verse and now explain to me why this doesn't mean Jesus and why you aren't going to be Christian instead. course, this is normal in many high schools and many middle schools, I've heard as well. So here's the question. In the book of Genesis, it says, let us make humanity in our image. Ha ha! Slam dunk. It proves the Trinity, right? Because what else could God have possibly meant? Clearly, when God says, let us, God is referring to other things that are divine, not lesser than God, and therefore it must prove the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Aha! Get your way out of that one, Jew. Time to convert. It's humorously presented, at least I hope I'm making it, because I'm trying to take a little bit of the edge off the fact that our kids are having to answer these questions in a public school by their supposed friends who are trying to save their souls. Because their families think this is what they should be doing. It's because their church is telling them this is what they should be doing. And many of our kids don't know what to say. You know, they are Rav Safra. They're just trying to live a Jewish life. They're not boning up on obscure verses and interpretations in order to be able to defend themselves against the proselytizing of others, but now they have to. So let me ask you, how would you answer that question? Or have you all decided Christianity is right, let's go join, the church. The Trinity is clearly proved because we're speaking in the first person plural. No one has an answer. They're all Rav Safra.
So the first thing I would say is I would want to look at the Hebrew and the translation of the Hebrew to see what it really says.
Okay, it's a pretty good translation. It is a first person plural, let us. It is the we formulation of the verbs and pronouns and all of that good stuff.
And I would think that I would assume that when Hashem was saying us, he's referring to himself and to me, the reader. That's us.
Interesting interpretation.
I'm going to take this leap of creativity and integrate the Holy Trinity.
Yes, it is quite a leap of logic. I mean, obviously, one of the answers on this is, even if your interpretation is true, that God was talking to someone else at this point, why does that immediately leap into Trinity land and Jesus and whatnot? We'll come back to why they think in a second. But the more classic answers, of course, are that God is speaking with royal prerogative. No one ever heard of the royal we? Right? When the queen says, we are not amused, or now the king, it's not because they have a mouse in their pocket. They are speaking on behalf of the nation. And God occasionally speaks on behalf of, well, everything. And sometimes that level of majesty is reflected in a plural usage of verb, even though it is a single entity that is doing the doing. The other classic answer, of course, is that God is informing the angelic host that he has already formed, that this is now a new step, that this is a new stage of creation. And it is an FYI, if you will, to the underlings. It doesn't mean the underlings are carrying it out. It doesn't mean that God is looking for their permission. It just means that this is being established. However, say those who wish to retort and give us pause, but it says, let's make humanity in our image. Well, God doesn't have an image, but guess who does? Jesus. Therefore, it must be talking about Jesus because Jesus was a man, we're a man, therefore we have that proof that this must be what it is. Now, I know it seems laughable, and it is, and we'll explain exactly the underlying flaws in the logic here, but recognize that this is what people are being accosted with in casual conversation. All right, so let's deal with the underlying flaws. Jesus was a man, like I said. Great. So doesn't that mean, by their interpretation of image, that all of us must be men? Because after all, if we're using this as proof that God used the template of Jesus in order to make all of humanity look like Jesus, doesn't that mean that we should all be identical to Jesus? We should all look exactly like him, including being men. Doesn't seem to have worked out that way. we have at least two genders, probably more, depending upon your understanding of science and biology. Moreover, we have an entire range of different features of our body, not just our skin color, but our eye color, hair color, our size, our body shape. I'm sorry? You're telling me that he used the template of Jesus, but he was able to bake in that much variety, but without a template of Jesus, he couldn't have done that. No. It falls apart instantly upon a rebuttal, the same way that Rabbi Abahu was able to easily deflect the heretical claims regarding the verse in Amos. And there are other such passages. People will sometimes demand to know, who is the suffering servant of Isaiah? This is one of the classic tropes of proselytizing to Jews, that the suffering servant passage in Isaiah is clearly talking about Jesus, because it says that he will bear our sins and bear our wounds. It sounds, in hindsight, very predictive of the Jesus that was written with this in mind. And yet Judaism says, if you actually read the chapters around, the suffering servant are the Jewish people. The suffering servant in this metaphorical prophecy by Isaiah is talking about the Jewish people in relationship to the other nations. That we have suffered because other nations have behaved abysmally, and that we have borne the brunt of their crimes and have been treated as though we were a hideous outcast. That sounds rather apt as well. It does not have to be their interpretation. Likewise, the mistranslation of there being a young child, or a child born to a young woman as being a virgin, we don't even need to go into that. It is simply misreading the Hebrew from the start. Point after point after point. But my question is, are you prepared? And are you willing to answer them? If somebody comes to you at work and says, hey, I heard you're Jewish, but you know, doesn't it say in this psalm that there were thrones of judgment? And doesn't that prove the Trinity? Are you going to look at them blankly and say, I don't know? Or will you have an answer ready to go? It can be an answer particular to that verse, which is, of course, yeah, they had more than one throne. The house of David lasted hundreds of years. Or it can be a more generic answer. Why are you asking me to defend my faith? Why are you asking me to defend? Should I ask you gotcha questions in return? Should I ask you the questions that are challenging for Christianity to answer, or Islam, or Buddhism, or anyone who is attacking you because they believe their faith is superior and that yours is flawed? Fundamentally, most of us do not have all of the answers for every possible question that might be asked about any religion. It doesn't work like that. There is no brainiac that is able to absorb, synthesize, and produce answers for everything at a moment's notice. And so this kind of game should stop in and of itself. I thought I saw a hand. Yes. Mm-hmm. Which is exactly right. From our perspective, it makes sense. As the old saying goes, I'd agree with you if you were right. But you're not. And therefore, I have no obligation to agree. We have our own interpretations. We have our own chain of understanding. And that works just fine for us. And more importantly, that should be good enough for you. If you cannot be satisfied with me, as your friend, as your colleague, as your neighbor, unless I am exactly you, then you will never be satisfied. Because if you are Protestant and trying to convert me and I become Catholic, are you going to be happy? If you're Catholic and I become Protestant, will you be happy? If I become the wrong form of Baptist, will you be happy? If I become Methodist, will you be happy? I am not going to please all of you because you don't please each other. So exactly what are you trying to convince me of here? Other than I should feel bad about my faith. And you know what? That's a pretty terrible thing to try and do to someone else. But let's talk about the accusations of the heretics that are even more common these days, and that I think many Jews even feel more ill-equipped to handle. How can you support Israel as a colonial state? These are the questions that are becoming even more prevalent over the last year and many odd months. How can you support Israel as a colonial state? Don't you know that? It's the opposite. It is decolonizing. Answer one in a nutshell is, I'm sorry, I thought when people returned to their country that had been taken from them, that was not called colonialism, that was called going home. And if you wish to draw a line to say that if that happened 200 years ago, great, but if it happens in 1948, it's bad. Or if you want to draw a line that if it happens to the resettlement of people after World War II, it's okay, unless they are Jewish, in which case it's bad, then I think we have a different issue here than colonialism. There is something underlying your misunderstanding. But of course, we can also answer that question simply by pointing to, well, the lovely organization that they like to point to, the United Nations. Israel was created with the approval of the world community as the country that she is. So if you believe that Israel is illegitimate, then you are saying the United Nations is illegitimate, and you are saying all the other countries that the United Nations also gave their stamp of approval on, that began after World War II, are also illegitimate because the only reason they exist is because the UN said they had a right to. Now, if you want to go down that route, we can have that conversation. But if you only want to have that conversation regarding Israel, and every other country that received approval from the United Nations is fine except for Israel, every other country that was put into place by the world community is fine except for Israel, then I don't really think that it's an issue of colonialism that you're upset about. There is some other bee in your bonnet, and playing it off as colonialism is really a canard in your argument. Yes?
So, sorry, I just have to share this since it's brought up. So, this week, my manager at my work told me that the phrase, and I don't even know why this should have come out of my work at all, she told me that the phrase in the Bible, this day I have set before you both life and death, choose life,
Mm-hmm.
means that you are only choosing life if you choose Jesus. She sat me down in a meeting with her in the back and said, I want for you to pray to know the truth of Jesus as the one true God. And
Wow.
I disclosed it to my area manager, and I said, I only don't understand how to proceed if this is to happen again because I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. She responded by telling me on my day off that she went ahead and interviewed everyone in my office to get, I assume, a better gauge on my character because I'm new there. I would be the one that they want to be. So my thing is that it's not an attack against your faith. It's not an attack against your character. It's a thing about status, and it's an attack against your life or your livelihood. And we're asking how do you respond. I don't think that kind of behavior deserves a response. I think we need to find a way to protect ourselves, and that's it.
So there's an unfortunately far too apt example of exactly what I'm trying to describe. That you have somebody at the workplace completely inappropriately asking an employee, especially somebody new, hey, let me tell you why you're wrong in being Jewish and how you can be right by worshiping our religion as instead of. And that when that is brought up as a problem, the person who has been accosted is now the person who is suspect. Because why are they making waves? Why are they making things difficult? Why are they complaining about this? Which is a completely wrong response to a completely wrong action in the first place. And yet this is what we deal with. We should not be surprised. We can be disappointed and we can commiserate with you, but this is not that surprising, and it is going to continue. And not only about religion, but also about Israel, or about any other topic. For example, did you know the Jews are in control of Hollywood? They're in control of all the media. Everything that you see, everything that you hear, the music industry, the movies, all of them are designed for Jewish propaganda. Still, exactly. Do you have an answer for that other than chuckling? Check out the stock market. Oh, of course, because all the Jews are bankers, and all the bankers are Jews. So, sarcasm and humor can sometimes work as a deflection, but also you can trot out a few facts. Do you really believe the majority of the bankers in the world are Jewish? I'm sure that would be a surprise to all of the non-Jewish bankers in Europe, the United States, Japan, China, and the rest of the financial markets around the world. That it turned out that they were all Jews all along, and they didn't even realize it. And if you wanted to say who was in control of the world's wealth, you might as well say men. Because after all, the majority of world wealth is controlled by men. But nobody considers that a conspiracy. Nobody considers that a ploy. No one considers that a cabal. That is, well, normal. But when a Jew has wealth, that is abnormal and therefore by definition suspicious. It is perfectly normal for the normal people to make movies about Christmas or to make movies about action heroes or superheroes or dramas or comedies. But for a Jew to rise up and be able to have a say in the culture, in the media, the music, the art, the literature of a country, well, that's abnormal and therefore by definition suspicious. You see, the very fact that they notice when we do something doesn't mean that we have done something wrong. It means that our existence is wrong in their eyes in the first place. Or at the very least, our noticeable existence. Sit down, shut up, and stay quiet, and we'll let you get by. Put your head up too far, and we'll knock it off, like as happened to the baker in our story today. But as a Jew, I'm tired of keeping my head down. I'm tired of politely demurring to answer to questions about my faith, or about questions about Israel, or questions about the Jews as some conspiratorial factor in the world. No, I'll answer your questions. I wish I could be Rav Safra and focus entirely on the path of Jewish life entirely. Not worry about the questions that are going to be asked, not worried about the harassment that we might face, and just live Jewishly in the beautiful, peaceful place that we want. But that is not the opportunity that we are being given. We can grab bits of it, but we also know that when we walk out those doors, there are going to be many, many people from every walk of life, from every race, nationality, social economic class, and political ideology that are going to look at us and say, answer. Answer for yourself, answer for your people, answer for your faith. And we will have to. If you're not quite sure how to do so, I am more than happy to set up private conversations or longer conversations with the group to make sure that you feel comfortable stating our position and your feelings about these matters. Because if you haven't had these conversations yet, it is only a matter of time. Be prepared, understand, and be proud. Shabbat Shalom.